So, it's all come to this. At the time of writing, Valhalla has been released and has wowed the pants off of all the reviewers who have pre-booked their caring consumer advocates working at the highly regarded news sites, and cemented that the new Memorpica style of Assassin's Creed is going to be the way things just are now. Previously, I completed a playthrough of Odyssey, which a lot of people say is a great game, so apparently there is a market for one of the worst things that happened to the series since the leaving behind of Ezio Auditore. After finishing the game, Odyssey is so fundamentally broken that I've decided to take a different sort of stance on this video. Instead of doing a rundown of subjective opinions, I'm instead going to break Odyssey down to its component parts and examine how none of them could have been put together to make it interesting or really passable entry in this series. Yep, we're going to go into this one with an objective look at things, putting together all of my arguments for why Odyssey was such a massive misfire of an attempt at a stealth RPG, whatever the fuck this was supposed to be. This video is going to be my long-awaited revenge for the wasted 100 total hours that I have put into this colossal waste of time. So, sit down, kick back, and prepare for the breakdown of the game that it turned me off of Assassin's Creed forever. Some people have said that the family drama main plot of Odyssey is a good tale well told about the coming of age and redemption of long forgotten sins. And for my opinion, those people are wrong. To think of the central conceit of Odyssey's story as nothing other than the meaningless pulp would do a disservice to all the video game stories out there that are actually thought-provoking and worthwhile. And just to be fair to the game, we are going to be discussing the bad ending of Odyssey, which the game does not prepare you for, does not tell you about in advance, and is an equally valid story to the good story. So, just to be fair, it's an equal path the game could go down, and it's shit, which is why we're still going to be talking about it. What the Odyssey of this Creed game was supposed to be was the main character ends up interrupting a traditional birth ceremony that would have resulted in their young sibling being thrown off of a cliff. As punishment for betraying the laws of the people, the character is then thrown off of the cliff themselves, and after miraculously surviving that crash, they end up being taken in by a cousin Roman level stupid trickster until they're grown up enough to leave their adopted home and begin traveling all the corners of the Greek world looking for their 3 lost family members, and eventually finding them after some ridiculous trials involving violence, deception, and ingenuity, all provided for you by the main story quest that you have to go do. It's the carrot at the end of a very long stick. The issue is that outside of the mom, the father, and sister end up not panning out to much impact on the story or the main character themselves. Alexios, in my case. For what should have been the big peaks of their character development, Alexios just leaves these encounters with these two pretty much unchanged, ready to bury them and move on within minutes of their final conversation. Sure, he'll travel all over the world into the lions' dens to look for them with Kratos-like steadfastness, but once it's actually all said and done, he could give 2 shits as he experiences no loss or grief over failing at the thing that has driven him throughout his entire journey. The mom being the big exception, since she's one of the best characters in the game. She's driven and stubborn, thoughtful, intelligent, a great planner, a great leader, and really able to hold her own in dire circumstances. Really, the game probably would have been a lot better off if it was about her, because it would have been a more interesting journey that way. The main plot only serves to be what other bad open world plots are, a guiding light to thread the rest of the game through. A story that serves as a distraction for player progression rather than this interesting tale that we're chomping at the bit to learn more about, which we couldn't do anyway due to the forced grind the game has the player do eventually. The plot turns in the story are incredibly few and far between, hours and hours of side questing and commutes across these vast regions of dullardry. And even when we finally reach those precious important quests hyped up by the journey in the game, they are mostly not really worth the effort, the travel, and the time spent. By the end of the game, when Alexios buries his dream of family redemption and gets over his grief inside of 24 hours, I finally realized that the Odyssey has accomplished pretty much nothing but wasting the time of Alexios and the gamer themselves. A story is only as good as its characters, and that meant Odyssey had an uphill climb to be sure. Alexios and Cassandra are the typical Ubisoft protagonists. They're quippy, snarky, completely sure of themselves, arrogant, idealistic, kind and thoughtful while also being brash and unpredictable. Alexios is as fleshed out as he needs to be to fill his role, but once we leave his little starting world, you aren't going to be thinking about him ever again as a character, because the lack of interesting choices or plot developments in his story make his existence fade from memory instantly after completion. And again, the game could have helped this by cluing the player into what the actual important choices are supposed to be in the game in order to kind of have the player get more attached with the character because they know that their actions have consequences rather than treating every choice the same even if it has no consequences or not. What doesn't help this is that the other characters that are supposed to provide the encounters for character development are not fleshed out enough to make the plot actually turn. Alexios' father is reduced down to a few deadbeat dad trait cliches, being incredibly short-sighted and dismissive of the responsibility of his family ties when he eventually catches up with him. He's self-righteous in the face of throwing Alexios off of a cliff, and there's a near zero chance that the character will be able to make him see their perspective. And really the choice that you have to make is either you can forgive him rather than the other way around. It's a character made to be revenged upon if you make that choice. It's a plot device in human skin to turn and burn and then move on to greener pastures, and to not be cared about once they've finished their role in the story. However, Cassandra in this story is arguably worse. After leaving the family for her own destiny, she ended up being taken in by the Templar Order and eventually rose as their champion, an ungodly powerful and sadistic murderer that they use in order to dish out Templar dirty work. By the time that Alexios is reintroduced to her, she's gone completely off the deep end, fully brainwashed into the Templar Order and being so irrationally evil in all things that she does and completely unable to listen that there is no chance that Alexios can reason with and reach his sister to try and redeem her from her fate, which is how it went for me. Obviously, again, you could forgive her, but she's completely ridiculously evil, so it's kinda hard to argue against that. She's really made the choice, and she doesn't intend to walk away. You can try to help her see the other path, but is it going to take? It kinda is hard to tell because, again, they don't tell you how to make her change her ways and trying to find the persuasion options. The way that they have set this up makes the multiple encounters with Cassandra irritating after a while, since the scenes kinda ramble on and reiterate the same script over and over again if you're not making it work out. Alexios tries to reason with Cassandra and show her that her actions and her allies will lead her down a path of despair and destruction, and Cassandra doesn't listen and dismisses everything he says because she's usually the one having all the power and holding all the cards. This persists even to the final encounter in the bad ending, where both Alexios and Mom gave it the real college try to make her see the error of her ways. She plays a little deception, and then she ends up killing Mom in front of Alexios, leading to the final boss battle, and Alexios needing to kill Cassandra in self-defense, and the bad ending completely undoes his quest all at the same time. While the main character isn't great, the side characters are somehow even more flimsy than that. Usually played up as goofballs with a couple defining traits that occasionally show up throughout Alexios' travels to give him more quests and prod him to go along the main story paths. The problem being that the characters are so identically whimsical and comedic that you don't really get much into their personal history or get to learn anything really meaningful about them, the actual human flaws and traits that would make up a person. So you end up really not caring about meeting them or caring about them as people, and therefore their problems aren't really interesting, but you will do them because mechanically you need the XP and the content to play through in the game. The side characters are one-note ponies that fail entirely to be worthwhile characters that you will remember. If those characters did not have their special character models and dress sense, even in the game you would forget about them entirely if they didn't constantly mention their hobbies in every conversation. If we actually had some meaningful interactions, the power of choice to make with these characters, going on special missions with them so that we could see their skills, their flaws, develop any sort of relationship with them, maybe I would have been excited to see them instead of rolling my eyes anytime I saw them because they're usually just philosophizing about something that doesn't matter. In this section, I'm going to do the first time of this because I think the perfect comparison piece to Odyssey is going to be World of Warcraft, since Creed is now trying to be a single-player Memorpica, and so they both do revolve entirely around picking up and completing quests, which is a model that is as old as time itself in video games, even back when the term CRPG was legitimately used in the slang. Now, people do slag off WoW since a lot of their quest types do repeat over and over again, such as collecting things, killing a specific numbers of enemies, and maybe a bad escort quest here and there, and that is definitely the case. I'm not going to say it isn't. A lot of the gameplay is repetitive, but what makes it work in that game is the reasons for why you're doing it. There's usually a story reason given regarding the conflict that's happening in the region that you are directly helping to victory through your efforts. There's a direct purpose to most of the quests, and if you take the time to immerse yourself and actually read the story beats, for the most part, they are compelling enough drive to achievement to make the gameplay worthwhile, to give it a good context. And then you get into Odyssey, which does two things different to fail at this simple formula. The quests themselves are more boring, somehow, and there's no good reason for why you're doing most of them. The major difference is that in WoW, you are mostly helping a faction or a group of people. In Odyssey, you're mostly helping out individuals, NPCs that have no unique identifiers, features, or character traits, and to be honest, a lot of them are simply default models voiced by a small group of people that you'll see over and over again if you do a lot of side questing like I did. So, since there's no substance at all to these quest givers and their life story is supposed to be the thing you're investing yourself in order to help them out, again, putting context into the quest, if that's not there, how can you give a shit about doing the quest? Furthermore, since the game's selling point is giving you the choice to help out the Athenians or the Greeks during their war, and you are forced to do quests in both sides, how can you get invested in both cities' problems and woes if the game was supposed to be making you choose a side to take? If we could do both, then what's the point of even giving a shit that there's a war at all? This is exactly like if WoW forced the player to go do stuff in both Alliance and Horde cities for the same character. Why would you go do quests for an Alliance town as a Forsaken? It makes no sense, and it destroys immersion in the game. That you have this conflict that's supposed to be important, but mechanically, for the player character, it is completely the opposite of important. There's also no end point for the victories of the towns themselves. The actual war's outcomes do not matter. If you topple the Athenian government and replace it with a Spartan, immediately afterward you get the option to do the same thing to the Spartan ruler you installed, which means there's also no lasting consequences for getting invested in a town and the characters there within, if the entire game is built with these mechanics to simply keep the game running for eternity. If there's no ending to the story or any of the characters' developments, then what's even the point? I ask these questions because without the ability to care about the people or places you are doing the quests in, then you really are just ending up doing the quests for the quest's own sake, for the XP, and that's really freaking lame. The point of the quest is to have different gameplay experiences, see stories that are off the beaten path, something that's quirky or weird in new places, seeing new things. A huge amount of the questing in this game is absolute bullshit, down to the core. The NPCs that you get the quest from are copy-pasted filler characters bitching about a petty problem for a minute, then they give you another copy of the same quest you've already done 50 times beforehand. Kill bandits, loot bandit camps, talk to other NPC and then come back. Or kill random NPC for stupid reason and come back. Or get random object from a place and then come back. The types of quests you get in Odyssey make WoWs look like goddamn Witcher 3. It's like the side quests in this game only have 7 types of things to do, which is pathetic, since it makes questing so monotonous and catatonic at this point. Playing the game makes you more likely to fall asleep on the controller out of the sheer need to make something more interesting happen. The main quests really aren't much better, since they still largely use the same quest types in their lines as well, and as we've discussed above, the conflict in the city-states aren't creative enough to care about, and the characters are not impactful enough to learn more about in the grand scheme of things. So who cares in a game where you can topple a governor inside of an afternoon? And to make matters worse, Ubisoft, for whatever fucking reason, decided to include the most pathetic and incredibly lazy type of quest in their short list of quests to copy-paste all over the damn map. This type of quest requires the player to run up to an NPC, listen to them moan about something unimportant for a minute, hand them like 50 cents, and then that's the quest. Yes, Ubisoft decided to fill this game with so much pointless goddamn filler that they legitimately have the player literally pay for their XP multiple fucking times because they couldn't think of anything to do. They seriously couldn't think of anything better in their supposedly ambitious sandbox, so they have you do this bullshit panhandling multiple times. At least the random NPC murder requires you to run a stone's throw away and hit one button and then come back. At least there's something to that. These buying XP quests could literally get done in 5 seconds, and you're not even required to listen to the quest giver at all. It's not like anyone frickin' tests you on it. I mean, what a great deal. The quests of Assassin's Creed are fucking terrible, and it wouldn't be so bad if there wasn't such a forced grind to advance the story, so in part, you are forced into doing some of this nonsense. And even then, there's no point to questing at all, since Odyssey includes a mechanic that infinitely reproduces these quests so that the game can live forever. So you can't even complete a city, because the bullshit time-killing quest will just come back the next session you play the game. It'll just come back. A few quests throughout the main story can be satisfying to play through, like Alexios winning the Olympics, but these sparkles of creativity are simply drowned out ceaselessly by a quagmire of tedious nonsense from animated mannequins dotted across every city and every 2-bit town on this map. Because Ubisoft could not be bothered to fill their ambitious sandbox with actual content in it, like other companies manage to do. In a Memorpica, or really any sort of RPG, the point of doing everything is to develop your character, either through experiencing the narrative or by raising all those lovely stat points. The point of an RPG is to get to the point that you can access all the sexy skills of punching, force powers, or looking at computers so wisely that they'll explode, along with the feeling of backtracking to the starting grounds and giving everything there a wedgie and a napalm blast to the face. It's the true, satisfying dessert after a well-deserved journey of hardship and gameplay challenge. Again, this is something that Odyssey completely fails to deliver on, and it's yet another mechanic included with this game to give the player supposedly infinite content to experience. See, the reason why I don't play WoW anymore is that I do have a problem with Morpega completionism. I will be that guy to pick up all the quests in these sorts of games because I just like the grind and clearing the problems of a town in totality. The usual result of this attitude is that I can overlevel like crazy and basically enjoy the ride at that point through the regions that can no longer give you threats to fight. You just get to enjoy the story. I did the same thing in Odyssey and found out that at a certain point, leveling up in this game is absolutely pointless, just like the quests themselves. I found this out when I backtracked to a town I was at 3 chapters ago and decided to do some quests there for some cheap XP, and experience my incredible power level after a series of bad hunter battles that really left me worse for wear. When I started questing there, I found out that the enemies I was fighting somehow was at the same level I was. And this is the great lie of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. The game has a hidden level scaling feature as harsh as a Russian winter in 1754. At the beginning, each region in the game has a recommended level that you need to meet before you go there, since if you are over or under level 2 levels in that region, you'll either be insta-killed by all the enemies, or the XP would be so worthless that doing anything there would just be a waste of time. However, once you over-level a region's recommended level, you will suddenly find that the region will increase its recommended level as well, meaning that over-leveling in this game is literally impossible. You will always be fighting enemies that are at least at your level, even if you grind it out to the level cap. Which means that putting in more effort to do all the content or to gain all the XP in the game is a pointless endeavor since you will never overpower the enemies at any part of the game. Even regions you've already completed will increase in recommended level so that there is no escape from the bullshit. And there is a pretty clear reason why Ubisoft never wants you to get the satisfaction of being able to give the early enemies in the game's noogies. It's because they want to sell you the gear in the shop and the boosters. If you can eventually overcome all of the adversity in the game, then there is no incentive for you to check out their store. But if they make it impossible, it gives them better chances that you will seek out that wonderful XP booster, and I fucking don't respect it. They have ruined the RPG in the name of selling you add-ons, and likewise, I will never give them the satisfaction of that. Never buy those boosters. It's bullshit. Absolutely. World of Warcraft's defining feature, beyond the RPG grind thing, is that it has unique regions populating their set of different continents that each have a central town, a community that lives there, and some sort of unique enemies or conflicts to end up fighting. While these things could overlap, such as certain races fighting a similar battle in spite of being halfway across the world, the way that these different pockets of those communities were presented and written still made most of the regions feel like their own special places with different problems and perspectives on how they're living. What helped is that each region had some sort of identifying characteristic, such as a special terrain, a different color scheme, or the types of buildings in their cities, and the layouts of how the region is set up with their trails and landmarks. WoW's regions were smartly constructed to give each one a different feel to the next, along with the new stories to tell that the others couldn't deliver in the same way. It made the region boundaries feel real and important, since they were the dividing lines between two starkly different locales, and then we get to Odyssey, which again cannot manage to do this, even though it's made by a 1,000-person team. The problem with Ubisoft delivering these supposedly ambitious sandboxes over and over again is that in order to realistically build them in 2 to 3 years' time, rather than construct an interesting varied world of unusual settings, their sandboxes are filled with the same assets copy-pasted 100 times. The ancient Greek world is astonishingly large in this game, but the way that it was level designed makes it feel small and barren. you will see the same foliage dotted along most of the countryside, the same mountains, rivers, valleys, and features throughout the entire map. You'll be visiting new cities, only to find that the whole thing is just a reshuffled version of the city you just left. Even important centerpieces like the temples and the meeting grounds are reused to make the whole attempt of presenting these grand centers of power into a pathetic showcase for how Ubisoft was cutting corners. None of this game feels distinct and memorable because Ubisoft's developers didn't have the time to put into creative level designs or a characteristic world for their game to take place in. Even the most powerful city, Athens, is not as impressive as it's supposed to be, due to the frankly ridiculous amount of reused buildings taken from other parts of the game. Instead of being this robust population center bigger than anything else you've been before, Athens instead comes off as a place that was planned to be way too big, so they had to mass Control-C, Control-V to fill out the entire map they planned out. Athens does have these couple giant cliffs in the center to make it different from these other towns, but there is still nothing much unique to see and explore in Athens to justify just how stupidly huge it is for the sake of itself. And what didn't help is that in spite of having a large amount of NPCs walking around, without differing animations or ways that the NPCs can interact with each other, that also isn't copy-pasted so many times to becoming redundant, the large cities in this game feel like how a lot of bad Ubisoft sandboxes do. They're fake, lifeless, a town of meandering and pointless robots, badly disguised set dressing. These cities don't feel like where people live and work. They feel like a dumping ground for badly programmed human robots. The world of Odyssey was simply designed to be way bigger than anyone could sensibly populate to be realistic for development. The fact that you'll see the exact same intricately designed temple building as the biggest building in multiple small towns copy-pasted throughout the entire game is laughably lazy. The reuse being so routine in this game that you can start strategizing the most efficient way to scale these buildings, rather than being any way impacted by this colossal structure being a part of this town. Rather than having defining landscapes or cities to be included with the regions of this game, you can barely tell when you move between them since the landscapes are so homogeneous with everywhere else you've traveled to that you'll never know the difference. It's all the same trees, it's the same mountain treks, the same ocean voyages as any other part of the game, and there's no point in any way of this game being this sprawling with nothingness and pointlessness. The only exception to this is Sparta, which is deliberately made with new foliage and a colorful background compared to the rest of the game to have it stand out. And while they did start putting in defining features into that region, they still have to borrow buildings, NPCs, and geographical bits and pieces to dot across that map since they're still on a deadline, which drops that impressiveness of the only creative location in the game by quite a lot. Odyssey shows how amazingly well why it takes a long time to get a Skyrim level RPG world. Because you have to design it to be special and impactful as a setting, somewhere you actually want to go and explore. Instead, in this game, they took the cheap route and copy-pasted every asset in the game 200 times, rearranging it and then calling it the biggest sandbox in video gaming. Is it really a surprise that Odyssey's combat sucks? To be somewhat fair to Ubisoft, combat in Assassin's Creed has never been its strong suit. We've moved on from waiting to instant counter any enemy in the game with one button ease, to trying this misguided Dark Souls Batman amalgam that makes for an infuriating mess, rather than something done for filler that could have just been easily ignored. Thanks to the earlier mentioned leveling system malarkey, you can't even over-level to get away from the central issues of the combat. And what makes it even worse is that all of the combat elements are also copy-pasted around the entire map. There were like 8 different enemy types in this whole game. You got the regular soldiers, the heavy soldiers, the bow soldiers, and a couple big leader types. You'll see these same enemies garbed the exact same way as each other, with the same moveset copied 500 times. After a couple hours put into this game, you'll go into any enemy encounter and know exactly what to do in order to break it over your leg in one shot. Since Ubisoft puts so little investment in creating interesting combat encounters, all you really need is a couple general strategies for everything and you're good to go. The weapons you get follow the same formula. There are maybe 7 classes of weapons available throughout the entire game. Axes, swords, double swords, spears, and polearms, for example. Except for a possible couple legendary weapons at the end of the game, each weapon in a class will behave exactly the same way as all the other ones, and the only difference are stat increasers and status ailments, of which there are maybe 3 or 4 that are worth mentioning. It's typical looter-shooter loot system with pretty much no thought put into it, and what Ubisoft does to try and make the weapons stand out is just changing the numbers around, which does practically nothing to make a good combat system. Of course bigger numbers are important, but it's just the natural progression of the game rather than being an interesting weapon in of its own right. It's just not a system built for keeping a weapon around and upgrading it throughout the game. It'll instead be like your trusty cell phone. You'll pick a brand of weapon to stick with, and throughout the game you'll upgrade it 20 times and be treated the exact same weapon arcs and attacks that you liked already from hour 5. It's as shallow gets. The armor gets a bit more fleshed out since you'll be dealing with 7 slots for armor, and there are a lot of visual variances to the armor to enjoy rather than the weapons, but not each armor found is unique since there are so much of it lying around, meaning that you'll more than likely be trashing most of the armor rather than keeping ones you like, typical for any Memorpaga, which is why in other games, they might give you the option to transfer the appearance of certain armors onto different ones, so that you can keep the looks you like with the better numbers. I'm pretty sure this just isn't an option, and there'd really be no point in having it anyway. Most of the regular armor in this game aren't visually distinct from anything else. Again, these styles and these appearances will be copy-pasted throughout the entire game. So there is no armor that ends up standing out beyond, again, the legendary armor. It's just all about the goddamn numbers. The combat system itself is clumsy and leads to a lot of pointless difficulty. Movement is stiff and without invincibility frames for dodging, and even if there are, the hitboxes for enemies are inconsistent, so you can end up being copping damage for no reason in the middle of a fray. The enemies, even the low-level ones, which again don't exist, can be these health sponges, so fighting them is still annoying and pointless, since you barely get rewarded for killing them anyway with how much XP you have to grind in this game. You do have super abilities to try and make the combat more efficient, but it doesn't pull enough weight to make you that badass killing machine without a bunch of caveats, such as limited range or the duration. It seems like this entire thing was made to be way more complicated than it needed to be, and through that, didn't even fix its own issues to make the combat palatable and interesting. And then you get into the flame and the poison status ailments, which becomes very prominent in the late game, which can destroy you in a matter of seconds if you take the wrong hits. And since these ailments are more present in the beefy enemies, you end up getting destroyed by 2 mechanics hell-bent on fucking you over. The whole maniacal mess is a repetitive drain on this game that seeks to tip the scales in the enemy's favor so much of the time, where you fight these infinite series of clones of the same character at every location using the same moves, the tactics, and weapons the entire time. And then there's the fucking ship combat, which isn't much better. Bullet spongy enemy ships or pitiful attempts at reed boats are what you'll find on these trips, with these unwieldy weapons and cannons and tactics to try and master, and the same inability to overlevel everyone else out on the sea. And these extra requirements to grind up materials to upgrade your ship in order to take out the actual toughest challenges out there. It isn't about the boating skill, it's just about getting those pristine numbers up to snuff, since the ship fighting tactics and controls are so ridiculous that you could end up being sunk through no fault of your own, or being 5 steps behind in 5 seconds. It's such a back-footed experience. Combat on both of the fronts in this game are just a bizarre train wreck. that you'll either master it or it'll master you within the first few punches in the encounter. It's ridiculous. In the grand tradition of trying to water down their formulas even more, the Templars were not safe from these changes. Introduced in Origins, Ubisoft decided to start shifting the old idea of Templars being these interesting characters with their own personal motivations, issues, place into society, and abilities to the new one, of just changing them into Memorpica collectibles. Essentially tokens that you find throughout the game so that you can make Uncle Ubisoft happy that you're playing the game they intended you to do. In Odyssey, it's even worse since they expanded the number of Templars you can find in the world, so even the barest of characterization that they put in the Templar Guild in Origins got cut to shit in Odyssey. You might get a paragraph or two of text for most of the Templars, and that's it. That's all you get to know about them. The big idea was that in Odyssey you're supposed to find these clues in the world in order to find out who the Templars actually are, because it's a shadowy organization. The idea falls completely on its face, since you might find clues through random amounts of plot progression on the main path, or randomly finding documents while doing side activities. Instead of selecting a Templar and hunting them down deliberately through an interesting investigation series of quests, more often than not you'll begin hunting down the Templars and see that 6 on the wheel have been randomly unlocked earlier since you found some stupid document during your 27 side quest 2 regions ago. And what's even stupider is that a bunch of the Templars end up simply being random NPCs picked out of a crowd and simply designated a Templar for the player to kill. They don't even get a health bar or combat to do. If you freaking get there in your stealth, you can kill them with one button, which is how it was supposed to be. It's actual reward for being good at the game. Instead, they're simply another clone from the same NPC that you already interacted with 100 times before, possibly given a bigger health bar, and that's it. If you're good on your stealth, you can get in and out within 2 minutes if you freaking get the goddamn guard patterns down. All of this is just completely insulting to what the idea of what the Templars should have been was. The villains actually driving the plot instead of just being another series of copy-pasted NPCs with a special icon above their heads, and that's it. For most of the guys, there's not even a specific quest attached to learn about how they're destroying society. The game simply labels them, tells you that they're bad, and that's the be-all and end-all of who they're supposed to be. The Templars used to be the driving force behind the entire Assassin's Creed series. They're the antagonists, and now they've been reduced to this. The Feathers from Assassin's Creed 2 in human form. But I will be fair and say that a few Templars in the game are actual important characters, chapter villains, but again, a few of those Templars when the boss fight occurs are not even special fighters with their own moves and combat styles. They can just be another copy of the heavy enemy that fights in exactly the same way, except they get 3 times the health this time. But at least you get to have a conversation with them before they die, which does literally nothing to the story. Good job. Another one of the supposedly big selling points of Odyssey was supposed to be this new dialogue system that's found throughout the game, which allows you to interact with NPCs and the plot in different ways so that you can put your own stamp on your protagonist, Mass Effect style. And guess what? Ubisoft also didn't put the proper investment into fleshing it out so that it could be meaningful. Rather than being an important set of branching paths for your character consistently showing throughout the game, the progression of the plot remains the same throughout most of the game, and there are only a few typical branches that you can do, such as picking the good, evil, or neutral choice in conversation, choosing to form relationships or not with designated NPCs, and your choices might shut you out of some quests, but I would doubt this severely, since the game doesn't even care which side of the war you pick to be on, and allows you to go back on those decisions whenever you want, so I don't think a lot of NPCs are designed to refuse to give you quests. But as we've learned, again, the plot changes towards different good or bad endings depending on like 5 conversations throughout the game, and that's it. For the most part, the dialogue system is a shallow attempt to try and make the character interaction more interesting that barely affects the world or any of the endings that you get. Again, 5 choices throughout the game affects the actual endings. After doing some research on it, I wouldn't be surprised if the romantic options in this game are also a complete smokescreen that doesn't become an intrinsic part of your character. You'll have sex with them maybe once, and then you'll go on your merry way of being free and sailing the open seas looking for murder. Although on the flip side, you can seduce quite a few romance options throughout the game if you really want, but again, there's no great reward in it because we can't develop relationships with these characters, we aren't going to be seeing them again, they're not going to become a part of our party, or become an interesting character. Doing these optional things is not character development because it's never referenced before, maybe once or twice, I don't know. So, the only gift you really get into it intrinsically is just to get to see more cutscenes. What doesn't help is that it is very clear if you start doing side quests that the dialogue system for anything beyond the main quest was done in a slapdash manner and slapped together using pre-generated phrases and algorithms, which does make sense since Ubisoft wanted to make infinitely regenerating quests, but all this does is makes the entire game more repetitive, more robotic, and any sort of attempt at investing in this or characterizing any of this or putting any sort of story in this with this system on top of it was a complete waste of time. There are obvious skips, breaks, pauses throughout these entire interactions as the auto-generated dialogue and the animations just run their course and are badly strung together by the game because the algorithm is completely busted. It's embarrassing to see the player and the NPC both begin malfunctioning as they try to engage in the collection of side quests at any point in the game. Ubisoft wanted the big open world full of content to do, so it's the same deal as before. Copy paste, copy paste, copy paste. I'm kinda surprised that they didn't designate more random NPCs giving away side quests as romantic options, considering the ones that they did pick do exist, and they're just so pointlessly shallow anyway. It's not like there's a major difference, except that they probably actually got a voice actor specific to them. It shouldn't be much of a shock considering how lazily that Ubisoft designed, well, everything else in this game, that the world itself goes through basically incredibly minimal changes. Not a surprise for the game that gladly allows you to go through regime changes the way that most people go through pairs of socks. There is one exception to this, and that is when Athens is attacked in full force, which leads to a poison smog descending on the entire city, and the effect is honestly pretty cool as you go through that mission, because it changes the normally peaceful Athens into a dinky, despair-filled place full of violence and dying. However, once the chapter's over, the city will return exactly the same as how it was from the beginning of the game when you first went there, with the required characters dead or moved on, and no one will really be affected by the consequences of a city-wide disease terrorist attack. Other than that, the characters will shift, they'll move around, and the player will go to the new locales that look the same as the other ones. People will die and no one will care. The world isn't built to react to the actions of the characters in classic Memoria style, but a good way to build a strength with that restriction is to put good plotting into the quests that you're going on so that you feel like your efforts are actually breeding some sort of accomplishment. Again, Odyssey can't do this because its Odyssey is a dull, meandering affair that doesn't even have the time to be the family drama that it was intended to be in the first place. Not with the other 5 things that this game is trying to be simultaneously. Okay, so the framing device plot. It exists. It sucks ass, but it exists. after the, like, 4 reboots of the frickin' framing device plot throughout the second half of this entire game, starting with Unity, because that's when they literally couldn't give a shit, and they just started rebooting it constantly. A failed attempt to try and constantly raise the stakes, but instead just burning the cannon down at every opportunity to replace it with something else, new and stupid and monotonous and completely meaningless. The current protagonist is Lena, or Layla, who is an archaeologist who went rogue from a stereo corporation. She stole a mini animus so that she can work with the assassins to track down Isu objects so that they can save the world. You know, it's typical Assassin Templar stuff. It's the typical framing device plot. But the problem with it is that Layla has very minimal scenes, we barely get to see her, and even when she does get some gameplay to do, it's a complete failure, mess of shit, where most of the times it's her just going through a temple, Tomb Raider style, except it doesn't have any of the unique encounters, monsters, traps, puzzles, or really anything to make any of these temples stand out. You just go through the same monotonous copy-paste of puzzles, and then you get the thing you need. And then you can go back to the world where quote-unquote interesting stuff happens, because even as boring a world as Ancient Greece is, compared to the framing device bullshit, it's actually a lot better. She does go through basically no plot development whatsoever. She moves to like 3 different places, supposedly doing things that are important. She's trying to find Atlantis, which is the thing that she's after in the first place. But the problem is that the story is completely pointless, it's meandering, it's not of impact at all on anything, because we don't get the sense that she's trying to get to Atlantis specifically. Her objective is just to get Isu objects. So once she finds Atlantis, she'll just move on to do something else, and then she'll move on from that. Nothing about Atlantis actually makes a big impact on her. She doesn't get super invested in it. Templars aren't being sent down in droves, so there's no conflict, there's no flaws. So what's the freaking point? It's just a lot of bullshit. And then, you know, a couple interesting things happen in the framing device plot. But again, Layla herself is so uninteresting of a character that when these interesting things happening, again, she's not surprised by it, she's not impacted by it, she's just completely used to it and just takes the thing she wants, moves on, and no one gives a flying fuck. Everything else in this game happens off screen. We don't get to meet the new characters that they're trying to put into the framing device plot. We don't see the new assassins. We don't see the new Templars. We don't get to see the stakes. We don't get to see the conflict. We don't get to see the big picture of what's going on. It's all happening off screen on a radio, and maybe if you read the freaking codex, maybe then you can get the answers. But who the fuck wants to read a codex on a story that's so incredibly boring as this? Layla herself is a half-decent character. Again, they characterize her exactly the same as Alexios and Cassandra in being arrogant, quippy, comedic, and, you know, flippant to danger and all that. It's just kind of typical protagonist stuff. It's a character that we've seen a bunch of times, and again, it kind of prevents us from getting invested in Layla as a character, because she doesn't have to go through any major conflict, she's just good at everything, and we don't get to see those flaws, we don't get to see those conflicts with other people. She's alone for like 90% of this game, which again defeats kind of the point of trying to do this fucking character. I'm pretty sure at this point the only reason why this framing device bullshit is still happening is because they literally pay people to specifically work on this. And they have staff members devoted to this. And it sucks. It sucks super hard. It sucks the life out of the room because they put no investment in it, they don't put any focus on it, they don't put any time in it. Nothing interesting happens in it, so why is it even in the game? Okay, these pointless distractions are completely destroying the gaming experience. Just go through the sandbox straight. We don't need the fucking framing device plot at this point if you are not going to put any effort into it whatsoever. Just fucking scrap it and move on. Or try harder. Do something that makes this worthwhile. Jesus Christ. As we have examined many of the game's fundamental flaws, it's clear to me that some of this nonsense was included in the game on purpose. The fruitless questing and leveling system, the punishing, dull, repetitive combat, and the undeveloped world and narrative. In some part, Ubisoft wanted their massive RPG to be a plotting mess because it allows them more opportunities to shove their player base into the shop. The combat is a mess and you can't get away from it because if you can master the combat, then there'd be no need for the player to gain access to more XP or better weapons through the store or the included loot boxes. And yes, there are weapon loot boxes. You just have to find the out-of-the-way vendor, which I did like twice throughout the 100 hours I played this stupid game. I bought like 5 loot boxes and then left and then never saw him again, which was good because fuck loot boxes. If the game had good progression and was vibrant and interesting, then you wouldn't have the opportunities for the players to slow down and think if they need anything that was in the shop to improve their game experience because it is so boring and monotonous. If the game got too interesting, then you lose the potential sales since the players will actually be focused on the game that they're playing to fill their free time instead of wondering, hey, the game's really dull. Maybe I should go in the shop and check it out because it's a shop. Maybe it has useful shit in it. Also, the removal of stealth options in this Memorpica are a direct result of Ubisoft monetizing their combat. Again, if there was an easy way to avoid the combat all the time with the traditional insta-kill hidden blade attack to reward the player with actually being good at the game, then you completely lose the potential weapon sales in the stores due to the stealth being included as it should be. It can't be because Ubisoft believes in the combat system of this game. It's a floundering mess built on inconsistencies and a brutal number generator. Ultimately, I hate Odyssey because through its entire design and mechanics are things made bad on purpose so that Ubisoft can attempt to make more money. I don't respect its business model since it's dripped so far into the intrinsic mechanics of the game itself. And with that being said, I think I have made my full argument about why Odyssey is one of my least liked Assassin's Creed games. I mean, it's still not as bad as the Assassin's Creed DS games because those were, well, they were very badly made and there was nothing redeeming about them. Odyssey is such a bizarre case because we can dig into it this much. How do you fuck up on such an incomprehensible level as Odyssey does? How do you have a game that lasts for 100 hours and all of the stories it tries to tell completely fails to make an impact on any level whatsoever? Why the fuck is Alexios included when his story sucks? Why is Deimos such an stupidly overconfident and evil character that can't see reason if their life depended on it? Why is the family drama so strung out, so infrequent, so undeveloped that it's barely impacting on the plot at all? It barely calculates into it. Up until the point that in the late game, Mom comes along with us as a major recurring character. Why are the options in the game to make the plot worse? That I can actually have this experience? Why is there not notices in the game to actually have the player improve their choice making to actually get a better ending if that was the one you were supposed to go for? Why are all the mechanics trying to screw you over when it's supposed to be a video game which is supposed to be about the player succeeding through challenge, not through repetitive and completely bullshit numbers being thrown at their face until they fucking fall over? Why is the game so full of stuff being copy-pasted forever? Why is the game so fucking huge when it itself cannot handle its own existence? I have these many questions with Odyssey because they did not put the time and effort into fucking anything to make any of this justifiable or to make it any sort of passable fun time. It's monotonous, it's dull, and this is coming from a fucking WoW veteran. WoW is vibrant and interesting compared to fucking Odyssey. And people said this is the high watermark for the 3 Memorpica games that they released. No, I'm fucking done at this point. Like, this game is a huge, colossal monument to wasted potential and time. It's such a fucking grind through infinite copy paste that I cannot literally believe that professionals are fucking making this game, okay? A lot of this stuff seems so deliberately badly done that it could have been a fucking indie project if it wasn't so obviously high budgeted. They put the budget in all the wrong places, but it has a high budget. The quest is threadbare and completely devoid of interesting plot turns. The world is non-reactionary. The side characters you barely meet and keep track of as you constantly wander into the wilderness where nothing is, interacting with the same enemies over and over again. I was not kidding when I said that this game probably only has less than 10 types of enemies in it. It's completely absurd how many times you will run into people who are dressed exactly the same and act exactly the same as their entire clone army. And this would have been helped if we were fighting, a whole bunch of interesting encounters. Maybe, bend the actual historical realism to make a fucking interesting game. If you're not going to be putting the effort into actually making the historical interesting, you need to pick a fucking side. You need to make games better. And I don't care how many shills give you fucking 10 out of 10s for your shitty goddamn sandboxes. I know better after playing Odyssey, and I am not going to fucking trust Assassin's Creed until they fucking relent on some of this amazing level of wasted time. It's a monument. It is the prime example for how Ubisoft wants to make their games. Like, it's not even an interesting sandbox, and it's one of the biggest sandboxes they've ever made. 500 square miles big, shallow as a fucking puddle. There's no fucking excuse for this. I cannot believe how fundamentally fucked up this game is. Like, it's amazing. It is a fucking masterclass in how bad an RPG can go if people are not committed to actually making a legit RPG. It is astounding, and I'm done with it. I am done with this series until it fucking changes. Absolutely. I am so fucking tired of these games. I hated Origins. I hated Odyssey. The only fucking light at the end of the tunnel is that one of their DLCs is actually good, because they put some time and effort in it to make something that's actually an interesting locale, actually a sandbox that has things I want to see in it, okay? And that's what Odyssey completely lacks. The family drama, complete smokescreen. The romantic options, smokescreen. The goddamn dialogue system, pointless, repetitive nonsense, okay? There's no effort in any of these. They just threw in all these mechanics in trying to make one of the most innovative sandboxes they've ever done, and none of it works. It's like this game had no fucking vision other than build something to make the business better, rather than making a fucking game. It's a product in every term. It's not a game. It's dull, meandering product to sell to people, slap a name on it they'll recognize, and they'll, guaranteed sales. You don't have to put effort into it. Or you can put the effort into anything you fucking want. No one gives a shit. And that's what Odyssey is for me. It's a game, it's a high budget game that no one cared about. Okay, they wanted to make it impressive to show off in the trailers. It's not a scam, but it kind of feels like one. So, yeah, that's my view of Odyssey. I literally can't respect it. I don't want to look at it ever again. And this is one of the longest videos I've ever made. This was my revenge. This is my absolute revenge quest on Odyssey to justify an entire month of my life being wasted on this monotonous nonsense. I am so fucking tired of it. I'm gonna end this video with a final scoreboard. Don't expect anything. And I'll see you next time. Hopefully something else on the backlog project will be 10 times as interesting as this, because you don't have to try that hard to be that interesting. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Victory for gamers, and have a good night.